This is the video presentation for Friday, September the 4th, 2020. For those of you who are not in class today, you need to do the 5 questions that are associated with this video. Now, everybody in class is going to be doing a review. So it's important that you do this because their review will be counted as part of their letter grade. The last colony to join the English colonies occurred in 1730. James Oglethorpe was a financier from London. He proposed to King George that land be set aside for those who wish to pay off their debt so that they would not have to go to debtor's prison. Now, in those days, it was a commonly accepted practice that if you incurred a debt, that you and your family would be placed in prison. Now, while in prison, you would work off your debt. And once your debt was worked off, then you could go back into society. Oglethorpe's idea was to allow the people who were in debt to go to the New World. They would work, and when they had paid off their debt, they would be set free. The king agreed, and the new colony was named Georgia in honor of the king. Georgia was not a successful colony. For the most part, those debtors who were placed in Georgia, once they got there, would simply walk away. In time, the crown took control of Georgia, and Georgia became the least populous the least populous colony going into the American Revolution. Well, this is the last slide for lesson 3, and we're going to make a quick turn so that we can start on lesson 4. So give me a second to do some switching. Lesson 4 is about the colonies in the 1700s or the 18th century. Now, in the 18th century, the colonies will band together and eventually rebel from Great Britain. Now, that has to have some explaining, plus why did we rebel? And that's what this lesson is all about. When we have finished this lesson, we will need to have a quiz. I'm imagining that the quiz will be either on the 10th, which is a Thursday, or the 11th, which is a Friday of September. That's next Thursday or Friday, so please be ready for that. England in the 17th century had begun to colonize, and we know that there were a total of 14 colonies. We also know, after the Glorious Revolution, that Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth will merge into Massachusetts. Now, the idea was that all of the English colonies were to practice mercantilism. The idea was that raw materials from the English colonies would be put on a boat and they would be sent to Great Britain. In Great Britain, these raw materials would be turned into finished goods and they would come back. Now, there should be no trading amongst the colonies. There should be no trading with the French. There should be no trading with the Spanish, no trading with the Dutch, no trading with the Swedes. That's how it was supposed to work, but it didn't. The 17th century in Great Britain was one of great political intrigue. We know that the Cavaliers and the Puritans are going to fight against each other. We know that King Charles I is going to be executed. We know that his great-grandson, James II, is going to be forced to give up the throne in the Glorious Revolution. Since England could not supervise its colonies, problems developed. There was also a shift in power in Great Britain. Originally, under the Tudors, all of the power rested in the crown, and the crown was advised by a group of people called the House of Lords. These are men who someday could become king if circumstances were right. But by the time we get to the 1700s, power has shifted to a wealthy middle class. Now, in Great Britain, if you do not have aristocratic birth, but you own property, you are wealthy, you are known simply as a commoner. Now, Parliament, which is the law-making body of Great Britain, became divided into two houses. The House of Lords, that would be the aristocrats who someday might become leader, and the House of Commons. Now, the House of Commons could never become the leader of Great Britain. But during the Glorious Revolution, not only did James II leave, but when William and Mary ascended through the throne, they gave certain privileges to the House of Commons. Amongst them, the House of Commons would elect one of its own. That person would be called a Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister would deal with more of the day-to-day activities of the Crown. Traditionally, this had always been something that the Crown had done. By the early 1700s, now that the Parliament is ready to make laws, Parliament begins to make what are called mercantile laws. Now, mercantile are laws that deal with trade. If the colonies break the mercantile laws, they could go to jail. They could be fined. They could have their cargo confiscated. They could have all of the above. But it was too late. In the 17th century, that's the 1600s, Great Britain had practiced what economists and politicians call salutary neglect. Now, salutary neglect is where you do not enforce the rules, because Great Britain did not enforce the mercantile laws. The colonies were forced on their own to develop industry and trade. Each colony had its own assembly. Each assembly began making laws that benefited the colony. Assemblies began to work with each other. One colony would have a trade, One colony would trade with another colony, and the legislative bodies for both colonies were happy with this. They would not charge a tariff or a tax on importation. The people who lived in the colonies began to develop a different culture. They began to speak differently. They began to look at their colonies less as part of Great Britain and more as true and independent countries. Now, we learned that proprietary colonies were begun from 1660 to about 1700. We know that the proprietary colonies were in the hands of the people who the king had given land to. We also know that after the Glorious Revolution, proprietorships will be taken away from New York, New Jersey, Maryland, the Carolinas. The only one that survived was the Penn family. The Penn family maintained proprietorship of Pennsylvania. Now please remember, the Pennsylvania area has the highest population of all of the colonies in the New World, and Philadelphia has the highest population of all of the settlements in the New World. In royal colonies, so let's take out Pennsylvania, and by 1700 all the other colonies are now royal colonies. All of the royal colonies were part of the Crown. The Crown ran the colony. However, the Crown no longer was able to exercise power over the colony because that power had been given to the House of Commons. So the way it works, let's say a royal colony like Virginia needs a governor. The House of Commons will go to the king and say they believe this is the best choice. The king either says yay or nay. Now, if the king says yay, then the person is appointed governor. If the king says nay, then the House of Commons goes back and picks one. But gone will be the days of a royal favorite being governor. But again, it is the assembly that holds the true power. Now, from Maryland south and in New Jersey and New York, there were colonial legislatures. The colonial legislators were dominated by wealthy landowners. Now, in Virginia, we gave them a fancy name called the House of Burgesses. In colonies like maybe North Carolina or Maryland or New York, we would just simply call them by the colony's name, assembly. But the people who made up these areas are the same. Well, what does a colonial legislature do? A colonial legislature works with the governor and comes up with laws that benefits that particular colony. Maybe the creation of a road, maybe the deepening of a river, maybe trading with other colonies. I'll trade you this, which you need, for that, which I need. New England was different though. New England is going to have the charter with the leader of the church. Now, the church has always been the most important aspect of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire. The leader of the church obviously is the minister. Now, the charter that these states, these colonies operated under would not allow the minister to hold political office. However, after a law had been debated, the people who were debating the law would go to the minister, and the minister would give either a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Now, we have such countries today that operate this way. In politics, we call this a theocracy. When a religious leader is asked to give his approval to an action by an elected body, this is called a theocracy. So let's say that in a particular town in Massachusetts, they want to extend the road out to the next settlement. They would talk it over amongst themselves. They would then write up the proposal, and before they would vote on it, they would go to the local minister. And they would say to the local minister, "What do you think?" And if the local minister said, "Well, I think that's a good idea," then they would do it. If the local minister said, "No, I have reservations. I think this might be too hard on my congregation," then it would quietly drop away. Now again, this will continue into the 18th century, the 1700s. Now in New England, members of the congregation of the church would meet and discuss problems. Now if you went to an assembly in some of the bigger states, area-wise, you had to be a wealthy landowner. In New England, the only thing you had to do to be gaining admittance to this meeting was you had to be a member of that church. Well, what happens if you're not a member of that church? Then you are not going to get in. A lot of places said you had to be a member, and a member in good standing. Well, how do you be a member in good standing? Well, the easiest way to do that is get money during collection time. Today, we refer to these as town hall meetings. No longer do you have to be a member of the church, but a lot of these town hall meetings are held in places associated with the church. Example, if you are a Tausite, you live in Taos. Occasionally they will have these meetings, and they will have them in the gym of St. Francis Xavier, because quite honestly, that's the biggest building in Taos. We have in the 1700s a refinement of what is called the class system. Now, there were many aristocrats, people who were born of noble birth, who came to the colonies to better themselves. Maybe back in Great Britain they couldn't buy land, but here in the colonies they could. So they would come to the 13 colonies, buy some land, and now they would be not only landowners, but landowners with a title. They would be part of the aristocracy. So at the top of the chart would be those landowners who own property and are aristocrats. Slightly below them would be the wealthy landowners. Let's say that you own a lot of land, but you do not have the title. Well, you then are not at the same class level as the aristocrats, but you are certainly higher than the other groups. Well, what happens if you are somebody who has come to this country, you have only pennies in your pocket, maybe no money at all. You can't afford land where the rich people live, and so you keep on heading west. You get into the mountainous regions, and there you begin to make your claim. You are what is referred to in colonial times as a frontiersman. Now, how long you can stay on the land to a large extent depends upon if the colony will let you live there without buying the land, or let you live there until you can make some money and then go buy the land. At the very bottom of the class system would be indentured servants and slaves. Now we know that once we get to the 1700s, the economy of Great Britain is going to be such that indentured servants are no longer part of the picture. Indentured servants had always been those people who are down on their luck and are willing to take a finance from a financier to go to the New World and work off that debt. In the 1700s, there's just not that many people willing to do that. And of course, along with indentured servants would be slaves. Most of the colonies are going to pass what are called slave codes, laws that deal with the slaves. Slaves can't do this, slaves can't do that. Now, the only colony that did not make a slave code would be Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania would not allow slavery, and this is because of its Quaker heritage. In New England, we have a person who would go below the aristocrat and about the same level as the wealthy landowner, and that would be the local minister. Now, in New England, the farms are, well, quite honestly, not very good. Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, none of these colonies are going to have a cash crop. Excuse me. They just can't grow enough to sell commercially. So what is going to happen is they're going to be, and we'll put more about this in our notes later on, they're just going to be able to subside with what they grow, or what we call subsistence farming. Many of the people who live in New England, though, are going to become what we call wealthy shop owners. They're going to make something. And this something that they make, they're going to sell to other colonies. Maybe they will sell to Great Britain, and then again they might sell it to other countries in Europe. One of the first industries to develop in the 13 colonies is shipbuilding. If we have naval stores in North Carolina, why should we drag all of that stuff 3 months across the Atlantic Ocean so that the ship can be made in Great Britain, so that it will take 3 months for the ship to get back to the colonies to be used? Why can't we take the naval stores and go up to New England? Now in New England, and New England is Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, up in New England, there are people who are looking for work. These are people who would gladly build the ships. So in a third of the time, we can build ships. Now these ships then could be sailed to middle colonies or southern colonies, are used in New England. Now you must emphasize in your notes that all of this is illegal. Mercantile laws say that the wood should go to England, and England should make the finished goods, and it should come back. But because of salutary neglect, this never happened. Now, in my mind, the problems are going to develop when England decides to enforce these mercantile laws. Another industry that is going to be great is that of what is called consumer goods, shoes. Shoes are something that we have to have every day. We can't get by without shoes. Wouldn't it be nice if we could have somebody in one of the colonies make shoes? Well, that would mean that we would have to take cowhide and tan it. We would then have to cut it. We would then have to shape it into shoes. What about cloth? Why should we send wool over to Great Britain, have them weave it into cloth so that it could come back? Why can't we just take the wool and turn it into cloth? Now, please be careful. Absolutely, under circumstances, do not write down the word cotton. Cotton will not become a product of the United States until about 1805, 1806. We're a long way away from cotton. In fact, cotton clothing was very, very expensive because it had to be made in England. What about iron? Why can't we take the iron that's already here in the colonies and smelt it so that we can make horseshoes, so that we can make knives and forks? Why can't we use the iron that we have? Why do we have to wait? And again, all of this just makes sense. And because it makes sense, the colonies are going to begin to make shoes, begin to weave cloth, begin to melt iron and make things with that raw steel. Now again, all of this is illegal, but because of salutary neglect, the mercantile laws have never been enforced. We're going to end today with something called triangle trade. Because of the ships the colonies have been making, they will take a cargo, say of molasses. Excuse me, let's say they have a cargo of rum, an alcohol, and they sail the rum to Africa. And in Africa, they pick up slaves. Now, the slaves are taken to, say, the West Indies. That would be some of the Caribbean island nations. The slaves are offloaded, and now we load up on molasses. The molasses is taken back and is turned into rum. Because we are sailing in a triangle, this becomes known as triangle trade. Now, there were about 20 or 30 different routes that you could take for triangle trade. Some of the triangle trade went to France. Some of the triangle trade went to Spain. Some of the triangle trade would go from one colony to another, and then maybe to a foreign land and back. Now, I would like to show this video, but every time I keep on showing videos, for some reason YouTube has been blocking my presentations, saying that I've gotten it from a foreign site, which, by the way, I've gotten from YouTube. So if you can figure that one out, you're better than me. So we're going to end here today with this. Again, if you were at the softball games, if you were not in school today, make sure you watch this video and answer the 5 questions. These 5 questions will be taken for a grade. Thank you.